Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is February the 10th, 2020. This is podcast number 44. Once again, I am excited. We are going to continue our conversation about time. But before we delve in this podcast, let me clarify a couple of things. Some of the things that I've talked about in this particular podcast go against established notions about certain concepts. But this is not to defy the scientific community. I am not trying to present scientific understandings about the world. This podcast is based on a philosophical approach to the world, to the reality of human beings on Earth. So if you happen to hold a scientific understanding of some of the notions that I discuss in this podcast, please bear with me because I am not trying to defy those notions. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. All right, I'm back. All right. Now, this is a pretty powerful idea because the goal here is to define time, okay? And in order to define time, we have to understand how time is understood from a human perspective, okay? Because my goal here is to refute that time is how human beings understand it and define it. Because there's something more to time, okay? Because time as it is understood right now is limited, is confined, okay? Time is put in a box, and that box is history. That box is a box that is contained within the capacity of the human brain to extrapolate what time has to offer. Okay? But the human brain cannot understand time if the human brain is looking at time within the context of a human brain understanding time. In order for a human being to understand time, the human brain has to go beyond. It has to go beyond the human brain. It has to understand time outside of the purview of the human brain. In other words, time has to be understood not within the context of point A and point B, but within a different context. As I said, time as it is understood is that there's a point A, there's a point B, and there is a point C. That is how time is explained throughout time. I mean, it's ironic that time is explained throughout time as time, and meanwhile, what time is not even understood as time. What we know about time is based on those 3 points: A, B, C. Okay? You go from point A, which is the point of a temporary present, okay? And that temporary present for every human being is the time of consciousness. It is not the time of birth, okay? It is the time of consciousness. In other words, time for human beings is the time that they are conscious of everything around them. But for the person from which or to which they're conscious about, time begins when they are able to be conscious about themselves and everything around them. In other words, my time is not the time of my mother and will never be the time of my mother because I wasn't there when my mother was conscious of her time. So that takes us back to the whole context that time, as human beings understand it, is based on point A, point B, and point C. And it is firmly ingrained in human psyche that there are 3 points to time: the past, the present, and the future. Okay? And because there are 3 points to time, according to human beings, they can understand time universally. And that concept of time being from point A to point B to point C is what gives us everything that society, humanity as a whole, has been built upon this premise of time. Because everything that we are, as far as the society, as far as the species on this planet, is based on our time on this planet. The first human beings, how they evolved through time, and how they affected the time, and how they shaped the future. Okay? That's the history of the human being. That's the history of humanity. Okay? Time cannot be ABC. Time can never be ABC. In order for time to be ABC, there ought to be a point where A was not A. And if there's a point where A was not A, in other words, before A existed, there's a non-A that existed, then time must have been before A existed. Because there can be no point A unless there is a point in which A wasn't there. And if there's a point in which A wasn't there, A in itself is not the beginning of time. A cannot be the beginning of time because something existed before A. And that thing that existed before A, that's what created A. That's why A was able to burst or to spring out of nature. Then if there's a point before point A, that point cannot be the past. Because if it's the past, it assumes that the past that we know, we've always known, is a forced departure. It's a forced past. It's a forced point of departure. It's a forced beginning. It's an erroneous understanding of the beginning of time. Because time did not begin at the point we think it began. Time must have begun before time was understood. And if that is the case, what is time? We have to go back and try to analyze what time is and how are the implications of time as it is understood in the universe by human beings. And that understanding is the reason the universe is the way it is. It's the way human beings are where they are in the universe. Because of the inability to understand time. The inability to see time for what time is. Okay? How time is understood. Time is understood, as I said, as point A to point B to point C. Therefore, everything in nature has a beginning and has an end. Okay? And that is based on this notion. The whole concept of evolution evolved. Evolution evolved out of this understanding of time. And thereby evolution in and of itself did not begin when it is understood to have begun. Because if evolution began at a point where time began, then evolution in and of itself is a product of time. Thereby, evolution cannot mark the beginning of time. There was a time before the evolution began. And if there was a time before the evolution began, then what we know about time is what we can know about time. Is what we've allowed ourselves to know about time. But there's more to time than what we think we know about time. Because time is not limited to a box. Time is not limited to a capsule. Time is not limited to a particular point in which one can say time is from here to there. Time is a constant. And because time is a constant, there is no way of knowing when time began, and there's no way of knowing when time is going to stop. And thereby, it is impossible to know what the future is. Nature does not have any future. There's no such thing as future. A future is a concept created by human beings as their incapacity to understand the time, the present in time, the place in time. Okay? So what is time? Now, presently, time has been the subject of everything. As I said, time, as it is understood, is the reason why we know so much about the universe. At least we think we know about the universe, okay? The places in which stars are, how stars form, when stars form, how stars die. All these are our understanding of the universe that are based on time, or our understanding of time. Our understanding of time is what creates this necessity, or this need for understanding time as time is explained to us. One must wonder, what is time? The answer to that question is simple. Time is time. Now, from a more realistic world, what is time? Time is what so many thinkers have thought about ever since they could think about themselves in everything around. In other words, ever since they were conscious of themselves, they have been asking, what is time? Ever since they were conscious of themselves, they've been asking, where did I come from? How did I get here? When I go, where do I go? The answers to those questions are there. The answer to those questions are right before our eyes. The answer to those questions are in time. Understanding time will answer those questions. If we know what time is, we know where we come from. If we know what time is, we know where we are. If we know what time is, we know where we're going. Because time is the essence of the universe. Okay? The way time is understood is that there's a point A to a point B, and from a point B to a point C. Time is understood from a historical standpoint, meaning time has a path. And that path from point A to point B is understood as existence. In other words, from point A to point B, time is understood as history. From point B to point C, time is understood as survival. Okay? However, in nature, time is always constant. Time is always there. And because time is always there, there's no point A, there's no point B, and there's no point C. There's only one point in time. And that point is time. And that time is the constant between what was and what could be. And what was is visible in nature. Because nature in and of itself, has certain trademarks which tells you what time is and where time is and how time behaves. Okay? Understanding these patterns gives you an idea of what time is. Time is a constant that's always there. If you take the law of gravity, as it is understood from a human perspective, the law of gravity exists because there are elements that are acting. In other words, the law of gravity is based on the notion that point A, as it is explained, is the point where a matter was, and point B is the point where a matter is, and the point C is the point where a matter will be. And that law of gravity is the law that dictates the behavior of that matter. Because the law of gravity is the law that explains how the behavior of the entity is going to be. And this law cannot be transgressed within nature. And because this law cannot be transgressed within nature, one must assume that the law of gravity is always there. And if the law of gravity is always there, the law of gravity in itself is a constant. Okay? It's a constant that is acting upon everything that is within its realm. Okay? It's a constant that acts upon everything that is within its realm. In other words, the law of gravity can never exist unless there was a point A and a point B and a point C, as the law of gravity is understood by human beings. The law of gravity would never exist unless there were 3 points. Unless there was a point A, a point B, and a point C. The point A being what was, the point B being what is, the point C being what ought to be. Thereby, a past, a present, and a future. But this future cannot be transgressed because it is a law. So what is understood from this is that the law of gravity in itself is a component of time. It's an element of time. However, it is not explained as time. The law of gravity is not explained and understood as time itself. The law of gravity is understood as the law of gravity within time and space. In other words, it is not seen as time itself. Rather, it is seen as something outside of time, something that acts upon time. But the law of gravity in itself is time. And I'm not going to get into detail to this now. Okay? But the point I'm making here is that there can be no law of gravity unless there are time and place, or place in time. So in that sense, when we speak of the law of gravity, what we're really speaking of is time. Okay? Because what the law of gravity does on Earth, it exerts time. The law of gravity is what makes time on Earth. It's the gravitational pull that creates the rotational movement of the Earth. And that gravitational force is what gives the Earth the illusion of going through time. But time is a constant. The only way you can see Earth going through time is when you are on Earth. That's the only time you see time passing by. The only time you know there's time is when you are on Earth. The only time you can witness time is when you are on Earth. If you were to be outside of Earth, you would not know that there is time. Or at least you would not understand time. Because time in and of itself is a constant. It's a constant that is always acting upon itself. It's a constant that does not move from one point to another. It's a constant that's always there. Okay? It's the element, it's the entity that are within that constant. The entities that are within that constant. These are the entities that experience time. Thereby, time is time. Okay? So many scientists have talked about the speed of light, for instance. When they speak of the speed of light as something that travels from one point to another point, because that's how the speed of light is understood. The speed of light is understood as something that travels from one point to another point. Okay? But the problem with the notion of the speed of light is that the speed of light only exists within the confound of the consciousness. Within the confound of the consciousness of the entity that is perceiving that light. Okay? If there's no entity to perceive the light has no speed. whatsoever. So in other words, the light does not exist through time. It's the entity that is within time that perceives the light at a particular speed. Okay? And that particular speed is what's going to translate time in itself. Okay? So when we say the speed of light, time, what is meant by that? Because at the end of the day, the speed of light, as we understand it, is a concept that is based on our capacity to perceive the light. Okay? But that entity, it's there through time, and it's always going to be there because time is a constant, and gravity in itself is a constant. The force of gravity is always going to be the force of gravity within the purview of what the force of gravity is supposed to be. Okay? But the force of gravity in itself is not a separate entity within the confound of everything else. The force of gravity is everything else. Because everything is something when it is acting upon by gravity. And the mere fact that gravity is there makes that thing what it is through time. So I will come back to this notion. I hope I don't forget, but I will come back to this notion, because what I'm trying to say is that time is constant. Time never changes, never moves. However, the entities within time, and I have to explain how things come to be in time. Okay? How things come to be. For example, when you look at Earth, okay, and then you wonder, well, how did life evolve on Earth? Okay, life evolved on Earth because of time. That's the only thing that creates life on Earth. The life itself was created because of time. Okay, there are certain elements on this planet that are in coherence with time that gives you what time could give at that moment, what is possible within time. Okay, and as long as what is possible within time is possible here, as long as the elements that are here are possible within time, what we know as life is going to be. Okay, and the main idea that I want to bring home here is the idea that everything that exists in the present also exists in the past and will also exist in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope you sort of get a good sense of what I try to explain in this entry. But anyway, let me clarify once again the purpose of the podcast, because I don't want any misunderstanding as to what it is that I am trying to accomplish here. This podcast is about, philosophical understandings about human existence. Human existence is intertwined with two things: geography and time. So we cannot speak about ontology unless we understand when and how the human exists. So that is why this podcast is sort of peculiar to the extent that it talks about those notions within the confound of what nature is, what existence is within nature. So I hope this particular installment was informative, entertaining, perhaps enlightening. That concludes our season 5. In the meantime, enjoy the previous podcasts, go back, listen to them, try to make sense of the arguments that I am trying to echo in these entries. I also encourage you to go to my official podcast website, www.thebenwoodjohnsonpodcast.com. There you will find all my previous podcast shows and seasons. You will be able to listen to them on a podcast by podcast basis. You will also be able to listen to my live radio station, which broadcasts previous podcasts randomly. So there you'll be able to listen to the whole thing. So again, this is the last entry for season 5, and season 6 is coming up in the next couple of months. Until then, go to my website and enjoy the podcast. Until next time.